Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the final session of our ITF Transport Outlook launch. This session focuses on freight transport, and for those of you who have just joined the program, welcome. To those who have stuck with us right from the beginning, it's great to have you still here. My name is Malithi Fernando, and I am a co-author and the project manager of this edition of the Transport Outlook. It is my pleasure today to be moderating this freight session. You will hear shortly from my colleague Francisco Furtado, who will present the findings for the future of global freight transport. We are then delighted to be joined by Jan Havenga, who is a professor in the field of macro logistics from Stellenbosch University. He'll be kicking off our interactive discussion, and you are most welcome to participate in this discussion through the poll. The poll is on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can answer that. It'll remain open until after Jan's first few words. And you can also participate in our Q&A session, for which we will be joined by Luis Martinez, our lead modeler at the ITF. The Q&A function is on the right-hand side as well. Please ask your questions there. There's also a discussion box if you would like to chat with the other participants, but if there are questions for our panelists, please do include them in the Q&A box. If you have technical difficulties, you can access support through the live support button. It's on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And with that, I believe that's it for housekeeping from me. I'll hand it over to Francisco to kick our presentation off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Malithi. Good evening or good morning, depending where you are watching us. I'll jump right in to some of the key facts, some of the key findings we obtained and are presented in the freight chapter of the Transport Outlook. And I ask all our viewers one question. Did you know that freight accounts for more than 40% of transport emissions? And actually in 2020, this past year, according to our estimates, half of all transport emissions were done by freight, by the movement of goods. Of course, it was a very particular year, as we know, due to the COVID pandemic. And while personal mobility was highly restricted, goods and supplies had to keep moving. And the activity, the volume of activity of passenger transport fell in a much more drastic way than what happened to freight. Actually, some segments of freight increased. For instance, in urban logistics and deliveries, it actually increased. Now, on the long run, when we take a longer term perspective, the share of freight emissions is going to remain more or less stable. It also depends a bit on the scenarios. And in some of them, like you can see here in this slide, it can actually slightly increase. Now, despite all of this and the relevance of freight and emissions, the truth is that historically, this is a sector that has received much less policy attention than the passenger sector. And this is reflected in simple things like even the knowledge public authorities have of the freight sector, of the agents involved, and even data collection. Now, with the COVID crisis, there was a great increase in the public awareness of logistics and freight increased a lot during this pandemic. People realized the importance of the sector. It was more visible than before. And I think this is and we think in the ITF, this is also an opportunity to leverage this increased awareness and to increase the policy focus, particularly for decarbonization policies, but also of the general public and interest in the sector, and also for other type of policies. Now, another important figure is that when you look at the emissions from freight, a great majority of them is actually done by road. And by road, here we include both the non-urban type of trips, but also the urban and delivery movements. And as you can see in the graph, the share of road actually increases as you move forward in time, and this happens in all of the scenarios. So we have here a sector that when you measure in 10 kilometers, the activity represents about 17% of the total freight movements, but the emissions are two-thirds of the emissions, 17% of the activity. Well, this highlights the importance of promoting the attractiveness of multimodal solutions that include modes that are less carbon intensive than road, but there are limits to what can be achieved that way. And road transport has several characteristics, for instance, flexibility, accessibility, which are unmatched. And so it will always remain a key component in the transport chain. So it's a critical front to decarbonize. The decarbonization of the road sector itself, it's critical to achieve the freight transport decarbonization, and I would say transport decarbonization as a whole. Now, this is the last critical number I have to leave you with, and it's that if we continue with the current trajectory, with the current ambitions, and we do a return to normal, we are not going to achieve the climate mitigation targets. Actually, there's going to be an increase in emissions from this sector. Now, with ambitious policies, it is possible to decrease. And if we add to these ambitious policies, we leverage also some of the trends coming out of the COVID crisis, then we can achieve a 72% reduction in emissions comparing 2015 numbers to 2015. And what explains this gap and this reduction and this difference between the scenarios, first and foremost, is the increase in efficiency and the adoption of clean energy sources across all transport modes. And doing this in a very widespread and mainstreaming these clean energy sources. This is the first element. There's a second element, which is the decrease in demand for fossil fuels, like oil and coal. And if you think about it, currently, the transport of this type of commodities represents 30% of international freight movements, which are the majority of freight movements, constitute the majority of freight movements. So if we move towards a decarbonized world, not only in transportation, but also in energy production, manufacturing, habitation, etc., we will decrease the consumption of fossil fuels and the demand for transporting them. And this will slow down the growth in demand of freight. Another final element to this is an increased focus on resilience, on the diversification of supply chains, trade regionalization, and all of these trends would also help to slow down the demand growth. And then after seeing these key numbers, what are the main takeaways? Or we can also call it the key policy recommendations that you can see in the freight chapter or the freight component of the outlook. Well, first and foremost, to scale up, ready to adopt solutions. And many of these solutions are already deployed, but they are deployed in certain regions of the world and not in others. They are deployed for certain types of companies. For instance, in large companies in Europe, it's already common practice to have training for drivers, eco-driving. But for the small companies that actually constitute the bulk of the road freight sector, for instance, this is not such a common practice. So the first thing is to have these type of measures applied across the board, across all regions, and across all type of companies involved in freight transport. And a specific example or case of this happens in urban logistics, where actually there are already available solutions for low or zero tailpipe emission vehicles, namely for light commercial vehicles. and bikes and these type of vehicles. This is already available. In some circumstances, they are already commercially viable and more attractive than more classical conventional fuel solutions. So widespreading the adoption of these low and zero emission vehicles and fuels in the urban areas is one also of the critical areas. And other things like voluntary programs, which are associations, free associations between different shippers, carriers, and which constitute a privileged platform to disseminate best practices and also to offer motivation and incentives for the different companies to adopt these best practices. In addition to this, I would mention a boost in collaboration between the different carriers, between different private companies in the sector, and doing this with the aim of increasing the use of available capacity that already exists in trucks or trains, but is not taken advantage to its fullest, or to reduce empty trips. And by doing this, by increasing the use of available capacity and decreasing the amount of empty runs, we are reducing the fuel that's consumed. We are increasing the efficiency, lowering costs, and also reducing emissions. Another key insight here, a key takeaway, is that we need to align the price incentives with the decarbonization ambitions. So few carriers will adopt low or zero emission solutions if they are more expensive than conventional vehicles and fuels. But what happens nowadays, in general, there are the negative externalities of and emissions from fossil fuels are not included in the price of these fuels. And quite the opposite, there are tax exemptions on fossil fuels, namely for aviation, also for shipping, maritime shipping, but also in other sectors of commercial activity. So one of the things we need to do is to phase out these tax exemptions and include these negative externalities and the costs of emissions in the price of fossil fuels. But we should do this taking into account equity and assuring there is a fair distribution of both the costs but also the benefits that come with the transition to cleaner energies. And this is assuring this fair share between different economic and social sectors. For instance, by including this carbon pricing, not introducing it per se, but including it in wider tax reforms, but also taking in account in the different impacts that these measures, like carbon pricing, but also slow steaming, can have in different regions of the world. And regions that are further from the main producing and consumption centers will be disproportionately affected by these measures. And nowadays we know, or according to our estimates, the surface emissions per capita in OECD countries are 4 times higher than in non-OECD countries. So this is definitely something to take into account when introducing these measures. Now, currently, the only transport mode for non-urban longer distance trips that has a consolidated, mature, and relatively widespread zero emission solution for this type of trips is rail. Actually, if you look at the aviation sector or heavy duty long haul road freight, there are no short-term perspectives of low to zero carbon energy sources being adopted in a widespread or in being mainstreamed in the short term. But we need this. We need this transition in these critical sectors to low or zero carbon energy sources if we want to achieve the climate goals. And to do this, these solutions need to be available and need to be attractive to the users and to the carriers and the companies. So for this, we have to align the price incentives. I just mentioned that. But another thing that can also help and will surely help is having standards, accelerating the standardization of these technological solutions, both on the vehicle and the infrastructure side, because this will help to scale up these solutions and it would also allow them to be more attractive for the end user. And lastly, a critical element in all of this, and I'll end with this, are the stimulus packages to recover the economy post-pandemic or in this new normal. We live in a time of crisis, but this is also a time of great opportunities. And the decisions we will take today will shape the future to come for decades. And these stimulus packages can include investments into research, into alternative fuel production, distribution, improving the attractiveness and availability of multimodal solutions, and also, I would say, a very important element, particularly in emerging economies, in incentives and support for renewing the vehicle fleets, which are much older in these economies than in the developed economies. And this per se would already also make a big difference. Thank you very much for your time. Meliti, back to you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for presenting those results and those key policy recommendations. We are now going to move on to our discussion. So I'd like to welcome Professor Jan Havenka, who will be starting us off with some comments on creating a more sustainable freight transport sector. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. From my side, a lot of the things that we struggle with in macro logistics are actually picked up in this report. So it was wonderful to read it in many respects. I think one of the first things that I saw, which really just jumps out of the page, is the fact that we have a ton-kilometer forecast that is now lower than the pre-pandemic forecast. But the question is, when you ask yourself about it, why does it happen? It's probably driven by some of the things that you've mentioned, but also something like global trade. I think global trade has been adjusted downwards. This has been happening after every major upheaval in society. I remember after the 2008-2009 recession, the same thing happened and it never recovered. But at the same time, if we trade less, then what is going to happen is we're going to have more reshoring, we're going to have more nearshoring. That will increase surface transport much more. And the biggest portion of surface transport is road. And the one where we have the least good solutions is road. It's as simple as that. Things like integrated research agenda, standardization, meaningful technology sharing, that exists for other modes much more than for road. So that's my first problem that I see in this, is how we're going to solve that. The second one is that also was quite visible is what I call the material footprint of the developing world is much lower than the developed world. That is going to grow. We can have an increased middle class in those places, and we cannot negate that. That is actually going to put a huge pressure on this. And the only way in which we can drive this, or I can say we can manage this, is to understand that demand is not only going to come where it comes from now, where it's high. Demand is going to come from separate, different places in future. And how we're going to manage that? With data, with information, with intelligence. And that's where a report like this makes a contribution that I really appreciate. The third one is, if I go back to Gary Hardin, he wrote a seminal article, Tragedy of the Commons, in 1968. And he already said that if you have resources that are shared by a lot of people, then the society will bear a greater burden in the use of that resources than the person that actually uses it. And he talks about cross-subsidization, and he says there's only one way to stop it, and that is with user pay. The person that causes the damage has to pay for the damage. And I firmly believe in that probably will be one of the only ways in which we can solve this problem. The last point I wanted to make is we need urgent policy and infrastructure interventions. We really need urgent stuff. But in everything we do in terms of strategy, on a business level and on societal level, we need data. We need intelligence. We don't have enough of that. I have to say at the same time, publications like this Transportation Outlook goes a long way towards filling that gap. I really appreciate it. And maybe a last thought on my side, just a little bit tongue in the cheek. Every year, I look forward to this publication as one of those things that I can hang my hat on. So for me, it was a great honor to say these few words for the first time. Having always looking up to see this publication, thanks for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Jan, for those very insightful and well laid out points. And thank you for your participation here today. We'll now take an opportunity to hear from our audience and respond to the poll results that are coming in. So let me just close this and share the results. The question was, in order to decarbonize freight transport while fostering economic recovery and equity, which of the following options should countries focus on? And the winner is align price incentives with freight decarbonization ambitions with 30% of the votes. Following behind with 22% each, we've got supporting technological development in clean energy sources, both for vehicle and infrastructure, and accelerate standardization procedures to speed up adoption of clean technologies. The least popular options, with just 4% each, were strengthening international cooperation and increasing data collection. So perhaps, Jan, I will start off with you, giving you a chance to respond to some of these findings. Some of these were mentioned, I think, in your piece just before, and I will note that the poll was answered before you spoke, so the answers may look very different. You have a chance to respond, though.
No, I would 100% agree with what I call the user pay principle. I think eventually that's the only way which you can solve it, although politically it's extremely difficult to implement. So that portion of it I would really agree with. I will not agree with the data collection portion of it. I think people see data as something, do we really need it, or that is just something that needs to happen anyway, and we don't invest enough in it. We desperately need more data and more intelligence. More data and more intelligence will drive a lot of the other solutions. It's more like a precondition. So I understand that. It doesn't stand out as a condition on its own, but it's a precondition. Without that, we can't actually have this discussion. If we had no data, there would have been no outlook to base our findings on. But the user pay principle, I would agree with that. If we can find a political way in doing it, that is maybe the problem. How will we do it? But if we could do it, that will solve it.
Thank you, Jan. And perhaps, Francisco, you could add to what Jan has spoken about and the results that we see coming in from our poll.
Yes, well, I'll first start to say I completely agree with what Jan just said, and even before, about the importance and relevance of data, and particularly on freight transport compared to the passenger sector. And from a perspective of the public authorities, the lack of data and knowledge of the sector shouldn't be underestimated. And if we want to, even to assure compliance of measures, if we want to assess the effectiveness of measures, if we want to develop policies to the sector, we need to have this data. So I think this is something that should not be underestimated.
Thank you, Francisco. With that, I think we can move on to our question and answer period. So I will ask Luis Martinez to join us. Luis is our lead modeler. Welcome, Luis. We still have time for more questions, so please do submit them if you do have them. I'll start off with a question for, let's see, I will start off with Luis. We often talk about freight emissions, but the location of these emissions does seem to vary between where the goods are produced, where they're transported to and from, and where they're consumed. Can you comment a little bit about how the ITF models try and account for this?
Yes, thank you, Maritime, for bringing me in. Yes, this is a very interesting element that we added on this year on the Outlook, because Normally, we are just trying to focus on policymakers on the emissions that happen within their geographical boundaries. And we forget that the consumers, as Jan was mentioning, the products come from elsewhere. Then Europe, for example, are just concerned on the goods that are transported within EU boundaries. But we see that Europe consumes, is the region in the world which consumes further. Then a lot of emissions are happening for arriving goods here. And these or either are happening in locations where they don't have resources enough to develop more infrastructure or reduce emissions so significantly. And this is one thing that we have to be aware and address. That's why the consumer principle that Jan was referring, this is quite important, because I think consumers are not aware and do not internalize in the cost that they pay part of the emissions that they are generating, and also the decisions that companies make regarding location may also be influenced because of this not internalization for the final consumer. Then it's important for us to understand. Also, Europe has a higher level than other regions because of the fuel of fossil fuel, as Francisco was mentioning also before, which is a very large amount of the total of the freight transport, while other regions, they have their fossil fuels closer than Europe has also this a large share of the transport. The total transport is also of the fossil fuels. But nevertheless, that's an important element that we have to understand on the decarbonization of the sector, is that sometimes the markets of the consumer, which is in developing countries, which they consume most of the final consumer of the goods, they are not in the local.
And adding to that, there's the extra complexity of the international nature of some of the maritime emissions, for example, the fact that these emissions are not under one specific state's responsibility. How do you see these adding to the challenge of implementing a user pays principle? And do you have any solutions perhaps for actually implementing these kinds of measures?
Well, once again, it is a data issue. We will have to look at supply chains, and we will have to look at value chains. And the final consumer in the supply chain will have to pay whatever has happened in that supply chain. And obviously that cost will then flow back all the way back. So what will happen, for instance, to give you an example, we produce grapes in Uppington. Uppington is 1,000 kilometers away from the Cape Town port, and that gets exported to the UK. The UK, the person there buying that, there will be a label on it that will say, this is the carbon emissions attached to this product. And that will go all the way back. And people will stop buying our grapes that came all the way by road over 1,000 kilometers if we don't do something about it. But eventually, if the final consumer pay for it, the money and the cost and the burden will flow all the way back in the supply chain. But I think it will have to be with final consumption. And it's as simple as that.
Thank you, Jan. A challenging topic, but very, very important, as you mentioned. A question now for Francisco. We've talked about the large portion of freight transport that happens on roads. What is the role of rail infrastructure? Can it replace road transport? Is there a limit? Where's the decision made typically to go for rail versus road in our most ambitious scenarios?
Well, first, a broad answer. There is a role for rail, definitely there already is, especially in the movements when there is high volumes between origins and destinations that generate big volumes of freight. And that's why all around the world, freight is very associated, for instance, with ports. And whenever there is a port that is not a port with a significant movement, that is not connected to rail, there is, I would say, a stellar opportunity to develop rail. And even in Europe, I think the easiest or the low-hanging fruit for rail is in developing the access to ports where they are not already developed. In the model, and Luis can also say something about this, Okay, we have a rather, I think I'd say, rather complete modal choice that includes the travel times, includes by commodity type, the costs, includes also the characteristics of the infrastructure in place. And there's actually improvements to the infrastructure in certain regions that have already laid out plans and that we already studied, like in Europe, in also in Central Asia. Now we are also in parts of Latin America, we are developing that. And actually an area where we see there is a potential growth for rail is in the Eurasian link. You know, this is also an area where we see that in the future there can be some growth.
Thank you, Francisco.
Let me say that it will never completely replace road transport.
Luis, did you have a quick point to add to that?
No, it was quite clear. As Francisco mentioned, because road has always a role on giving on the flexibility on the low demand areas, on the where there is no big volumes to be transported, because rail has the main role also to concentrate and consolidate high high volumes to be transported, even cheaper and more efficiently even than maritime. Then we have to forget not that we are in some cases that rail is also not just competing with road. Yes, it is, but it's not competing. It has to collaborate with also sea, as Francisco was mentioning, but also in some locations where sea is not completely direct, there is a role also for rail on these connections.
There is. For instance, in the relocation of empty containers, rail is used actually.
Jan, did you have a comment?
In terms of railways, what is the biggest gap? And there's two big ones, and Francisco has mentioned the one. It's as simple as that. The containers that arrive on a port, it should be evacuated by rail in most cases. The biggest other opportunity is what we call domestic intermodal. There's the intermodal link between road and rail, where the large portion of the freight is in a container or a pallet-friendly container, and then the last mile is done both sides by road. This is a solution that exists very well in Europe. So Europe understands this. There's places like Hoekpak and Combiwagen, Combiverkeer and so on that does this type of thing. In America, domestic containers these days are more than ISO containers. There's more domestic containers on rail in America. In a developing world, it does not exist really. I see very little of that in India. There's nothing in South Africa. In India, where it should happen a lot of this freight that is palletized is on road. It should be on rail. It's long distances. It's 1,400 kilometer corridors. And you see all of these trucks, 60,000 trucks per day that goes towards Kolkata. And this just doesn't make sense. And the same in China, we just have that huge gap of intermodalism that we need to fill it. That's the biggest option. So that's the two, intermodal through the port and domestic intermodal.
Thank you, Jan. We have a series of questions that I'll group together for Francisco. Speaking about cleaner road transport, can highway charging solutions compare to hydrogen for long-haul freight? Have we thought about that? What do we think of highway charging, and what might be the role of biofuels? So a few different options for alternative energy sources for freight transport.
In the morning, I think we already discussed a bit hydrogen, so I will leave this a bit out. I'll just mention that when we look at the transition to clean energy and zero emission solutions, two key facts. First, in different regions of the world, different solutions can be more appropriate. And second, unlike what we have now, which is like a single energy source world, basically, which is based on oil, and then you have gasoline and diesel, in the future, there will be multiple energy vectors with biofuels, with hydrogen, electric roads to direct supply of energy, gas to biogas. So there will be multiple solutions in different regions of the world and for different type of operations. Like batteries nowadays, like I was mentioning, are already competitive for for the short distance light commercial vehicles. It's still an open question. Some people say yes, others say no, but there are even some announcements from some companies that they would have a battery truck, but I don't know. We still haven't seen it. At least I haven't. So, okay, I won't go along into that. But about biofuels in specific, and the biofuels it's an awesome example of this, because one thing is biofuels in Brazil, where they produce using land that was abandoned, that was agriculture land, where they have a very high, rich production of sugarcane that can be converted and made into ethanol, and where there is no land use, big land use impacts, etc. And it's produced and consumed locally, and several studies show that this is very sustainable, actually. Another thing is, for instance, Europe importing biofuels from Southeast Asia that come from the deforestation, and you're making biofuels after this forest. I mean, and this is not sustainable. So the biofuels depend on the context, and depend on how they are produced, on the emissions, even in the transport, and they might be a very good solutions in some cases, but not in others.
Certainly. Thank you, Francisco. We have just 1 or 2 minutes left. So, Louise, I would like to pose a question on e-commerce and what the role of that is in freight transport emissions. Can you give us a quick comment, please?
Yes, as we saw in this recent year with the advent of e-commerce during COVID pandemic, we see that the role of e-commerce has growing and growing, and we have here it has to be managed. I think this is the main element of the e-commerce. Especially, we have the urban part, which is the last mile deliveries, or the deliveries within urban, that we saw a big increase in the last year, and we are envisaging this for the long term. The problem of the e-commerce also for the long distances, and also for bringing products into the city, is if we go increasingly to peer-to-peer dispatching of e-commerce. If we have products that come each singly from a very long distance, and if they are not consolidated into regional hubs that can allow you for use more sustainable transport sources to arrive to the city finally, then I think the big challenge of e-commerce is not the e-commerce existence per se, is the format of e-commerce that we have expanding currently, when we don't have, as John was mentioning, a user pay principle, that the user is not conscious of the transport CO2 costs that arrive to their final location. If we had already e-commerce within products that are already, for example, within Europe, when we are consuming and they come to you by rail or by an electric truck, if they become available or not, as we saw, or as another source that is more sustainable, this is completely different than if it comes like 3,000 or 5,000 kilometers by plane, everything that you ask. And I think that this is the big challenge.
Thank you, Louise.
And this is the policy element that we may need to tackle.
For sure. And I'm going to squeeze one last question in, given this is our last session. Francisco, perhaps you could take a first stab at this. How can governments ensure diversity in freight transport decarbonization measures instead of focusing primarily or mainly on pricing based measures?
Well, I'll start by saying pricing, and we discussed this extensively. It's very important. But per se, it's also not going to solve the issue, because if there is not the infrastructure to make available more sustainable modes, if there is no money into research to develop the new sustainable technologies, if there is no infrastructure for the production and distribution of these alternative fuels, and part of this, I think it's very hard if it's not, I wouldn't say fully public funded, but if there's not a major component of public intervention in this, at least in this side of the infrastructure, I find this very hard to happen. So this is just to exemplify that pricing is indeed fundamental, both for the end user, but also for the companies themselves, the private companies that operate. But it has to go along with a series of other measures that that allow the good incentives provided by pricing to be actually taken advantage of.
Thank you, Francisco. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Luis, Francisco, and a special thank you to Jan for being with us. And this is actually our last session. So if you would like more information about the Outlook, the executive summaries are available on our Summit portal. Those are available for free in multiple different languages. If you also visit our ITF webpage for the Outlook, you'll be able to download the modeling results. They're linked to the OECD statistics database. There'll be recordings of these sessions and, of course, a link to the publication itself. As Jari Kappala mentioned in the opening of this Outlook launch day, the Outlook is meant to start a dialogue and it's a call for action. So thank you very much for your interest throughout these sessions. And please get in touch if you would like to speak more about our results or policy recommendations. I think all that remains to be said is have a good rest of your morning or afternoon or evening. Thank you very much and bye for now.